So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your participation on this sunny Friday afternoon. So happy that the sun is peeking out. We've had a very busy yet productive semester. So I thought we could use our final meeting today to engage in a professional development workshop. And I had the privilege of hearing Dr. Megan Pollock at an ASEE diversity event where she gave a highly interactive workshop on inclusive leadership. It was so well done. I thought to invite her here to CU Boulder so that she could engage with our council as well. So I'm going to give you a brief bio of Dr. Pollock, and then we'll get right into the workshop. And so Dr. Megan Pollock began her career playing with light projection on tiny microscopic mirrors as an engineer for Texas Instruments. Through her company, Engineer Inclusion, she now utilizes macro social systems that, when adjusted, improve student and employee success. A past recipient of the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship, Megan holds a PhD in engineering education from Purdue University, an MS in electrical engineering from Texas Tech University, and a BS in computer science from Texas Women's University. As an engineer turned educator, Megan focuses on helping others intentionally engineer inclusion in education and the workforce. Her company, Engineer Inclusion, is a full-service consulting firm that helps people intentionally and systematically engineer equity and inclusion into their organizations, driving positive outcomes and effectively supporting employees and the community. So we're very fortunate and pleased to have Dr. Pollock join us today. And with that, I'll give the balance of our time over to you.
Thank you so much, Terry. I appreciate it. Well, welcome everyone. And I go by Megan. Megan is fine. And so I am excited to be here with you today to talk about inclusive leadership. And so I am based out of Orange, Texas. I recently relocated to a very small, tiny town where I grew up. And I got to buy my first house, and it's been really fun coming back to my roots and moving from the big city of Dallas back to very small rural Texas to be closer to family. And my pronouns are she, they, or aya. And I always like to acknowledge that I am on the land of some unceded indigenous people. And part of my challenge to myself in returning back to my roots is to really learn more about the Atacapa, Coshada, and Alabama peoples here. And so I always encourage people to really think about and learn about the communities of people who are original to your lands. Also on the website, there is my sort of standard slides that you can download. And so they may not be the exact slides, but for people who like to take notes on that, you can access those on the website right there, okay? And I like to suggest people to do homework. I have no power over you, but I like to suggest that you take something and do something with it. And so also on the webpage, you'll find that I have a suggested action plan with some strategies and things that you can begin to work through. And so I hope that you'll take this action as something that you can do to begin to think about how you can apply this, because awareness is never enough. We have to take action. And I think all of you will agree with me on that. So our guiding questions for today are, first, we're going to talk about what is an inclusive leader. And then we're going to talk about how does one become one. And I'm really intentional with that language about becoming, because we are never 100% done. And it's always going to be this journey. And so we're going to work through the 4-part iterative process of becoming an inclusive leader. You're going to have the opportunity to assess and think about and reflect on your own leadership practices and how it might relate to the model that we're going to learn today. And again, I fully anticipate and expect that you're going to leave with more strategies and resources than you'll have time to tackle. But what I want you to be, again, focused on is at least taking something away that you want to apply. All right. So with that, you again have access to all the resources on my website, 7ev.co/leader. And again, the link is in the chat. The handout, just as a side note, the handout on the website is an abbreviated worksheet. The one you have is much longer and comprehensive than this one here. I always want to start with some agreements before we get started. From a practitioner standpoint, if we were going to have a longer engagement, we'd want to co-create these. But for a 90-minute session, I want to kind of set some ideas before you and give you a chance to think about this. And so every group naturally develops like normative behaviors, expectations, ways of operating. And so for us to intentionally engineer inclusion, we can set or establish norms that really scaffold the equitable and inclusive practices that we want in those spaces. And so I recommend starting with, I have an example on my website that you can use. And again, I think that this is linked from the resource page. But you can start with these, you can customize them there. It's a simple 4S alliteration to help us kind of get started. There's also some sample slides that you can use in every meeting that you're in as well. And so some people call them ground rules, group norms, shared agreements, guidelines, whatever you want to call them. I like to call it a pledge of how we're going to operate and co-construct our space and learning together. So the first one is to stay engaged. I'm not going to go deeply into all of these, but what I know to be true specifically for myself is I can get so distracted, especially when things might get pushed a little bit on my learning, that sometimes I can kind of tune out and get distracted. If that describes you in any way, figure out how to prevent yourself from doing that. So if that means turning off your phone, if that means turning off your alerts, whatever that means to do, really challenge yourself to kind of focus with us for this time that we have together. Share the mic. When we get into the breakout rooms, I'm not going to be in there with you all the time. And so I really want to make sure that you all are helping me in those small spaces and making sure that we're pulling in the quiet voices. We never need to give voice to anyone. Everyone already has voice. We just need to make space for people to share their opinions and their thoughts. Support others. So as we're on this discussion of a journey of inclusive leadership, all of us may be starting at a different place. And so we want to help each other navigate that with patience, kindness, and respect. We want to ask for clarification when we don't understand. Because if you have a question, someone else probably does have one too. It also means that we're going to reject stereotypes, prejudice, and bias, and really focus on unfiltered evidence. And then finally, we want to make a choice to call each other in rather than calling each other out, right? We're trying to create a space where we can come together and learn. And so when reminders are needed, we want to treat everyone with compassion and empathy. And then the final thing I want to offer to us is that we want to stretch and reflect. And so we're all accountable for our words and actions, myself included. I am constantly learning and growing in this journey myself and don't always say and do the right things. And I am accountable to those, and I welcome you to hold me accountable to them. We also believe that we can learn and improve our practice through effort. And so it's important that we model that growth mindset, that model that through effort we can grow. And then I really want you to take time to reflect on your own identity and how you come to this space. And we're going to talk about positionality a little bit later. So before I flip this slide, I just want you to pick to yourself which is going to be easy for you and which is going to be hard. And maybe think about a strategy for how you're going to make the hard one less hard. So take a second and reflect. Which one might be hard, and how can you make it a little less hard today? Thanks for your comment, Davey. I appreciate it. All right, so I want to get to know you all a little bit. Now, we do have a small group, but this is the first Slido. It's also a kind of a warm-up if you've never used it before. You can go to slido.com, but I personally prefer to use it if you have a smartphone, just kind of swipe over on the camera, hover the camera over it. And so even though that QR code's going to show on all of the slides, you don't have to scan the QR code every time. It's going to refresh with whatever question I have for you for each time. And so use this introduction as an opportunity to kind of warm up yourself to the platform. And if you're having trouble with Slido, just put your comments in the chat and I will see those. I've got multiple screens so I can see everything that's kind of going on. So a little bit of a warm up, who you are, what your role is, and what is it that you hope to get out of today's session. By the way, you can also turn open your mic as well. If you've never used Slido, you can see here at the top of the screen, it tells us how many people are participating. It tells us in the top right how many people have submitted. All right, so Davey's first. Hi, Davey, you're the coordinator of Bold programs. You want to bring it back to your student leaders. Awesome. Hi, Amy, your professor, civil architecture, environmental engineering, practices to use for inclusion in your engineering community. Awesome. So Eric is a professor looking for tangible actions practices. Yeah, so I really hope that you're going to walk away with these practices. So again, in the handout that you have, I have really explicit things that you can employ for each of the 4 components of the model. Natasha, hi Natasha, you are co-chair and a program engineer. You're looking for new tactics for listening and seeking input from members of groups. Awesome. I also have a lot of resources specifically on listening on my website that you can access as well. Got a few more people typing, so I don't want to cut them off. Oh, here we go. Janet, hi Janet. You're teaching faculty. You hope to get some inspiration and motivation to think about productive initiatives over your winter break. All right, Janet is going to have a productive holiday. Yay, Janet. All right. Oh, I missed somebody. Okay. And Terry, useful strategies for leading others. I think you're going to get that. Kimberly is a student rep. They're looking for what can you do to be mindful about inclusivity for your own growth? What can you share with your peers? So everything that I'm teaching today, you can share with them. And I'm coming at this work from 2 perspectives. What is it that you can do as an individual? And then how can you contribute this to the teams that you're working on? So I think you're going to get that. Dana is an advisor looking for reminders and new tips. Ashley is a coordinator, hoping to get insight into initiatives. And Mindy and I go way back. Hi, Mindy. Best practices for programs and faculty. Lou is a director, wants to become more educated on inclusive leadership and how to encourage leadership to also be more inclusive. Good. Chantal is looking for practices to use in your department and the college. Katie, more resources. Debbie, ideas. Awesome. I love this. So thank you all so much for your contributions to that. It's really great to get to know you a little bit. So let's dive in with my first question to kind of get your brain cells working and moving. And I want you to think about for yourself, what is an inclusive leader? When you think about who an inclusive leader is, what are those traits, the qualities, and the behaviors of inclusive leadership? So this is a word cloud, so I want to hear your input. Again, you're welcome to unmute your mic. You're welcome to use the chat if the Slido is not working for you. But I just want you to think about, to you specifically, I'm not looking for academic definitions here, but when you interact with an inclusive leader, when you think about your own practices and how you're engaging with others, what does it mean to be an inclusive leader? Those traits, the qualities, and the behaviors. So the first input here is that they value all voices.
I don't mind sharing out loud too, if that's okay, Megan.
Great. Yeah, go ahead.
For me, 2 things come to mind. I would say definitely having a growth mindset, and then also valuing accountability as well. I think are both important traits, qualities, and behaviors for inclusive leadership. And those 2, I think, really go hand in hand with each other as well. So
awesome. Thanks, Davey. Great key points, values all voices. Let's see, sometimes word, depending on your application, can break the words into, we lose the phrases, so sometimes that's happening. Expects inclusivity from all. I like that because you have an expectation that everyone is using these kinds of practices. We got a big emphasis here that there's a good listener. There's transparency. Transparency is one of my core values, and people are like, well, that's a weird value, Megan. And to me, it's a key value to me, because when I am being transparent, it means I'm actively trying to live authentically. It means that I am really trying to model the values that are important to me. It also means that we're not hiding things from everyone. So you're soliciting input. They read the room well. One of the articles on my website talks about listening and global listening. And that reflection really came up for me, especially, when I, as a facilitator going from all in person to virtual, I realized how starved I was, unable to use all of my global listening skills in a virtual space, because you can't see body language, you can't really see the way that people are interacting. And so you lose that skill to read the room. You're empathetic. People are brave around you. I like that phrasing, that you're an ally, that you act on feedback. I like that as well. So not only are you open to feedback, that you are intentionally taking action to respond to that. To me, that's deeply tied to accountability. Self-aware. One of my favorite books on self-awareness is by Dr. Tasha Eurich, called Insight: Why We're Not as Self-Aware as We Think We Are. That's one of the subtitles. I think she's changed it since, but it's a really great book. Awesome. Well, thank you all for your contributions here. I think a few people are still typing. If I miss you when I click forward, you can drop that into the chat. Oh, able to understand perspectives different than their own. Yeah, so being able to use perspective taking is a really key skill of an inclusive leader, and that requires the ability to really visualize and see and understand other people's ideas. Okay, well done. So what we know about inclusive leadership, it is a set of leader behaviors that focus on facilitating group members feeling part of the group, retaining their sense of individuality, while also contributing to the group processes and outcomes. So what I want to ask you to now reflect on is, what does it feel like to belong while being your authentic self and being a valuable part of the team, right? So if that's what an inclusive leader does, what does that feel like when you feel like you belong, when you feel like you get to show up as your authentic self and you feel like a valued part of the team? What does that feel like? Feel good? Does it feel bad? And all the things in between. What does it feel? So someone says it feels unfamiliar, right? So if you are traditionally in a space where you don't get to feel those things, it could be very unfamiliar. It can be rare. Someone says it's productive, right? So if you get to show up as your authentic self, you feel valued, you belong, you have a huge cognitive deload of all of those other things to sort of perform in a space to be able to contribute to the work, right? It's fun, there's happiness, there's a sense of ownership. It feels like the perfect fit, right? We're going to use, again, a metaphor of sort of the perfect fit here in a second. It's energizing. You have genuine interactions. It feels safe, right? It feels like you have some safety in that space to be able to contribute. Got one more person typing, want to see what they add. Feels elusive, all right. Cozy, okay. You feel connected and you have confidence. That's beautiful. So I think the takeaway is it feels good, but yet some people are still experiencing the sort of rarity of it, and to be able to experience that. Now, I want to share with you a quote from a friend of mine. And he emailed me. So my TED Talk came out a year ago, about to the week. And he emailed me after he watched it. And this is a quote from him. He is an engineer. He says that here. I worked in a male-dominated engineering industry, oil and gas. We had female engineers all the way back to the 80s. We had female engineers. I never saw them treated differently, but I never thought about how they might feel in that environment. Now, Tommy is a white man, and he is one of the nicest guys I've ever met. He's left engineering and now engineers triathletes. So he runs like a triathlete company. He's one of the nicest people I've ever met. And so when he had this sort of aha moment, to me, it was a description of him realizing privilege, right? So he didn't think that they had ever treated them differently, but for him, in a dominant space, it never occurred to him to think how other people who didn't fit that dominant identity would feel in that space, because it felt normal to him. The fit felt good to him. And I recently read this book by Dr. Marissa Franco, and I loved this very simple sentence that she had here. And she says, privilege means access to authenticity. So when you have the privilege, when you sort of share some sort of commonality with the dominant group in that space, that means you have greater access to authenticity. And so when we think about all of those identities, this is a very common example of how we, from Hall, of looking at diversity as an iceberg. We know that culture and diversity are not always visible. So it would be easy for my friend Tommy to look around and say, hey, we're all the same. We're all engineers, right? But because of his privilege, because he had that access to authenticity, it wasn't always easy without some intentional effort to see what was below the waterline. And so there's so many different dimensions of diversity, and this list is 100% not comprehensive. But we can look at dimensions of race. I have met many people who their race is assumed to be one thing because they maybe present as white, right? And so there is assumed similarity without a true understanding of someone's race or ethnicity. We have gender as a fluid, right? It is as a spectrum and how people identify and present. We don't always understand socioeconomics, right? And so there are so many different attributes of marginalized people and how they may not be seen in a space. And another way to look at this, and we're not going to go really deep into this model today, but when we think about Hall's model that uses this sort of iceberg, what we know is that we have this sort of visible culture. And there is this invisible culture that sort of moves down into this deeply hidden space, this unconscious kinds of culture. And this is the culture that people both bring to the space and the culture of an environment, right? And so those cultural forces of a team, then they create organizational forces. And these organizational forces, they produce outcomes, and the outcomes could be a variety of different things. They can be the structures, the rules, and the policies that are in place. I talked to a colleague recently, or she works for a different company, and they recently have a new CEO, and she says, we don't have to wear suits every day anymore, right? Because there was a sort of assumed professionalism, and I'm using air quotes if you can't see that, of how to sort of show up in a space. And it wasn't until there was a new leader to change those sort of patterns of behaviors of how you could show up in a space. And then what we then see as a result of that are these events and these symptoms. Now, somebody said in the forum earlier that the idea of experiencing inclusive leadership, it's like the perfect fit, right? Now, how many of you have ever been in a space where you are determined to fit in, right? You're going to do everything it takes to fit in. You're not going to let anybody tell you that you don't belong. But as a result, you end up adjusting, adapting, and assimilating to fit into a space. Has anybody ever experienced that? What's that feel like?
I wouldn't say I have tried to force myself into belonging, but it's been more so like I've had to adapt. So, this, even in this position, identifying as queer and non-binary, I have to be mindful of how I'm dressing to work at times. Even though people can say all the time, no, you don't need to be mindful about that, dress how you feel. It's a lot easier said than done, trying to build that confidence and comfort most of all. So I will say it is I guess a forced belonging of I don't want to fit in, but I have to fit in for survival.
Yeah.
If I'm going to be, respected by not even just staff and faculty, but by students too. Because even that can feel pretty intimidating at times, especially if students are coming in and they most likely are not coming in with that knowledge already or have interacted with someone who is queer identifying, and then you're taking into context like just the attacks that happen against queer identifying folks and trans identifying bodies, especially recently with Club Q, with Pulse back in 2016. Like it have it has you on edge, in which it forces you to kind of assimilate and adapt and adjust. And when you do find your people, then that's a different sense of belonging that you feel, where you do want to adjust, like because it feels comfortable and you want to get along with them because that is your community.
Yeah.
That's something how I felt. Yeah.
Yeah. Davey, thanks for sharing that. So, how I think about forced belonging is that we put the impetus on the individuals to say, well, just belong, right? Like, if you want to fit in, if you want to be a part of this, then don't expect us to change anything, but just show up and do whatever it takes to fit in, right? I think about my experience on my specific team when I was working at Texas Instruments. I did unconsciously a ton of adjusting, adapting, and assimilating to the sort of norms and values of that team, just as a function of trying to fit in, right? But what I didn't realize until after I left is that I had lost huge, like, chunks of myself in that effort. And this becomes a deep cognitive load. It's the shadow job of having to perform, of having to learn and function and do all of these things in a space. And when you do all of those things, it takes away your capacity to actually meet your objectives, right? To like bring your most brilliant self and bring all your great ideas. And so what we are really talking about here are how do we create structural belonging? Environments where people get to show up as their authentic self. So as Davey said, that he gets to show up and dress in a way that fully reflects his identity and not feel any repercussion of that, right? Like that's the sort of idea. How do we create space where I get to be a square peg in a square hole? I get to be a round peg in a round hole and not have to play that game. That's not a survival tactic to fit in. There's just space for me to show up and to be myself. Now we can look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I've recently learned. Excuse me one second. I've recently learned that, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs draws on a lot of indigenous work. And so I'm going to drop a link in the chat if you want to read more about that. So it talks about the Blackfoot wisdom that inspired Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so I encourage you to read that because I've been teaching Maslow's pyramid here for years, not knowing the indigenous history of that. And so I encourage you to explore that. But when we look at this very well-known and very well-cited sort of model of needs, we can look in and see that love and belonging are right in the middle of this pyramid. So we got to take care of our physiological needs. We've got to take care of our safety needs. And that is before we can actually get anything done, right? So we have to, think about how do we find that friendship, that sense of connection, that sense of belonging in a space before we can, again, get to those places of esteem and self-actualization. So these belonging and feeling valued, these are fundamental human needs. And people need to perceive that they are a valued member of a team and experience treatment that satisfies their needs for belongingness and uniqueness in the workspace. And so inclusive leadership helps us address those two critical needs. And it enhances performance, persistence, collaboration, it boosts attendance, and it reduces turnover. I do want to acknowledge that I misgendered Davey, so I'm so sorry. Please forgive me for that. You have some great allies who have also told me so. So thank you all for that feedback. I appreciate it, and I'm going to do my best to make sure I'm capturing that correctly. And so if you want to, back to this, if you want to read more about this original article that came out of the Harvard Business Review article, again, I think this is linked from the website, but why inclusive leaders are good for organizations and how to become one is a link here. Now, the model that we're going to be learning about today was published earlier this year, although we started this back in 2020. And so it's called Inclusive Leadership Development for Engineers, and it brings together, it frames how we got to this model. And so this is an open access, so you can read it on my website, or you can access that citation, and I'll drop that citation here in the chat as well. All right, so now let's dive into the model. So this inclusive leadership development model, it has 4 parts, but then there's 7 components total. And so we're going to work through each one of these. But before we go into that, I want to introduce to you the growth continuum and reflection tool. Now you have this in your handouts, but there's also an online tool that I'm going to encourage you to take here, a sort of quiz, because people like an assessment, and it's going to give you a sort of rating score. And so this inclusive leadership continuum is based on a growth continuum, an asset-based mindset. And so there are multiple stages to this. So the first stage of this is that you are aware, that you are recognizing that you have an opportunity to learn and practice knowledge and skills. A novice is the next stage in this continuum. And at this point, you're beginning to demonstrate some of those knowledge and skills, but yet you've got some limited use of the defined practice. Now at the stage of committed, at this point, you're committing to and expanding your knowledge and skills, but your performance is still inconsistent. Now, when you take the quiz here in a second, you're only going to be able to select one, but in reality, you also have in front of you, if you want to do just a hand one, you can do the hand one. It doesn't have a scoring system on it, but you might find that you are more than one of these things. So I might be both committed and one of the further ones here on the end, because I'm actively teaching and modeling it, but I'm still sometimes inconsistent. Okay, so a proficient person means that you're applying that knowledge and skills, but yet you are consistently and thoroughly showing those in a recognizable way. So that means other people see it. It's not just what you think that you're doing, right? And then exemplar, this means that you have an exemplary level of practice and you're intentionally modeling this element for others. So sometimes I see that I am both an exemplar and a committed. So I can still make some, more mistakes than I want to make, but yet I'm actively teaching these kinds of things. And then the final stage is that of a reformer. You are stimulating and facilitating institutional change to improve system-wide outcomes at your organization. So you can see that here together. And I want to give you a chance just to kind of pause and take the quiz. So it takes just a minute. So you can either take the quiz, the digital version, or do the one in your handout. All right. So we'll take a minute. I'll set a little bit of a little timer for you to kind of process how you're going to work through this, because this will give us an anchor point to build on. All right, let's come back together. If you've not quite finished, you can keep going. I'm just going to kind of set up and start diving into the things. Now, for each of the 4 parts, I've got 4 different things I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you what it is. I'm going to tell you what it is not, so what it does not look like. I'm going to give you some planning prompts. Now, planning prompts, what I mean by that is these are questions. These are guiding questions that you can use on your teams, that you can use as you collectively work together to begin to employ these kinds of ideas and practices on whatever kind of team or organization or approach that you're taking. And then the final thing are the specific strategies that you can employ, whether that's in the classroom, whether that's on your team or individually. All right. So let's look at the first one. So individual is you. It's looking in. It's beginning to recognize who you are. And so an inclusive leader understands the social and political context that creates their identity and understand how it influences and biases your perception of and outlook on the world. So what this really is your positionality. Now, positionality is an idea that was really kind of started in qualitative research. We had to recognize what is our positionality as a researcher, because it's impossible to not have our own lived lens and how we look at the work and the research. But positionality is really important for all of the work that we do, and our hiring practices, and how we collaborate, and how we lead, and how we teach. And so positionality is beginning to understand all of your functions of identity, and then how it begins to affect how you move through the world. And there is a suggested exercise on understanding positionality, and I'm actually working on rewriting this exercise. It's the top downloaded resource on my website for the last year. And so I'm rewriting it and building it out. So if you have feedback, I welcome it. Or if you've used this tool and you have resources to help me, I do welcome that. And so positionality, again, is really understanding who you are. It's looking in, understanding your identity. So what this does not look like is when people say things like, I'm just here to do a job, or I'm tired of having to be politically correct. Or when people say, I don't have bias, or I don't have culture. This is not what an inclusive leader is going to be thinking about, right? I often hear, particularly within the engineering world, people saying, well, engineering has nothing to do with identity, right? People think it's just about the facts and the formulas and the functions. Well, we know that's not true, right? We know that we cannot show up and do engineering without people. And so when people make up that space, we contribute to that. So some of the planning prompts that we can think about here are asking ways, like, what are ways that we can collectively encourage one another to reflect on how our identities create, how the political contexts create and inform our identities? So how are ways that we are nudging each other? How are ways that we are helping our students to begin to think about the sort of political context that creates their identity? For some people who are from dominant norms, they may not even recognize the social and political context. If they've never understood or been taught that gender and race are social constructs, for example, right? Then you don't begin to understand the ways in which those can inform and influence people's identity. Another question we can ask ourselves are, how are we inviting dialogue that expands social consciousness and explains how our identities bias our perceptions and outlooks on the world? And so that means, how are we talking? How are we engaging in conversation? There's a resource that's linked from the handout that talks about the difference between debate, discussion, and dialogue. And that's a really useful tool. I usually send that out around Thanksgiving. I don't remember if I sent it out this year, but it's a good tool to remember, how do we have dialogue and really begin to understand and bring together ideas, rather than always feeling like we're in this sort of polarized world. That's one of the challenges I faced in moving back to Southeast Texas, is being in the minority when it comes to some of liberal ideologies, as my parents and family would say. So some of the strategies that you can employ here are examine your positionality. And that doesn't mean like I do an exercise, I'm done. Understanding my positionality means I'm always thinking about, what are the salient functions of who I am, and how is that affecting how I show up at a different space? Because it doesn't always mean the same thing, right? How am I incorporating reflection activities in my today that helps me really think about how I showed up? So if I went to an event, I want to ask myself at the end of the day, how did I show up at this event today? How did my identity affect how I showed up? And then finally, creating a culture of feedback. And that was a big influence in what many of you said in the initial feedback. So I want you to think about, just for a second before we move on, based on the survey that you just took and how you rated yourself, we're going to think about some of the evidence that you notice in this behavior, and set a goal for one of these strategies, one of these planning prompts that you want to employ. So pause and reflect on this particular unit, and then share a goal that you set for yourself. What's a goal that you want to set for yourself when it comes to understanding your identity and who you are? All right, so the first person says they want to research who's not in the room when decisions are being made, to do outreach to those groups to have them included. All right, great, thank you. Invite someone from CU Dialogue to facilitate the session. I am excited to click this link and learn more about that resource that you shared. A couple other people are typing, so I don't want to skip over you. Make sure that you write this down on your notes so that you have it before moving on. I'm gonna wait about 30 more seconds before we move forward. Actively seek out and invite dialogue to collectively expand my social consciousness. Yes. How to not get discouraged by structural barriers, power dynamics to maintain your voice and input. Include representative student voice in decision-making and assessment strategies. To be more curious about the backgrounds and differences with mine of the student researchers that you supervise. Excellent. Well, I've got some great ideas here. Set ground rules for the group to build a brave space. Be curious, slow down. Yeah, this workshop is not a slow workshop. It is a fast workshop. So sometimes I don't do what I preach when it comes to workshops. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to move forward. I think I'm going to miss somebody's feedback here, but if I miss you, please copy it and drop it into the chat. So the second function of the model is that of a lens. So individual is how we look in, and then lens is understanding how we're looking out into the world. And so there are two key components to this. One is systemic thinking, and the other is the ethical dilemma of bias. So systemic thinking, and what this means is that an inclusive leader is considering how systems of oppression and advantage influence our decisions and impact our team. And so for many of us who have lived in systems that were made for us, so if you come from a dominant group, like as a white person or as a male or as a hetero person or as a Christian religious person, like these are all very dominant things in the United States, then you may not understand the sort of oppression that other people's face because you've benefited from the system. And so what that means is that for those of us who want to become inclusive leaders, we have to begin to understand systemic oppression. We have to begin to understand systemic advantages that may have been given to us and others. And so we have to begin to learn this. And admittedly, this is something that took me way too long to figure out. And it's because I was, again, part of a system that was mostly built for me. And so one of my professional goals is reducing the amount of time between understanding privilege and then understanding systems. Because it's one thing to say like, well, you know, I remember like when I talk with my dad says things, who happens to be a white man. He says things like, but I worked hard. And I'm like, yeah, it's not about whether you worked hard or not, right? It's understanding the systems and the barriers that other people face that you didn't have to face, right? And so that's the kind of systemic thinking that we want to build and develop. And so it's a little outside the scope of what we can accomplish today, but you can learn about the 4 I's by watching this great little video. And if you're not on my mailing list, I'm working on an article on this that I'll be sending out probably in January. And so what's really key to this is understanding that ideology is at the root of this. And these become interpersonal things. So these ideologies influence how we interact. They then become institutionalized in how we build systems as policies and procedures. And all of these external things then affect people. So people who have internalized oppression, so people who experience, internalized feelings of all of these sort of, so like if a person who is LGBTQ can hold lots of internalized issues about their identity because of the ideologies and institutions and interpersons, right? So that is an example. The institution, the oppression has done its work, right? It doesn't even have to continue to oppress the person because they have internalized that. And so then those individuals have to do work to uncover and deal with those kinds of things. And so this is the key labor here, is really understanding systemic oppression. The next key piece of this is the ethical dilemma of bias. And what I mean by that is that you begin to investigate how interpersonal and institutional bias produces a dilemma that we have to address, right? So when we look at our institutions, when we look at some of the outcomes that we see, we can't just say, well, people aren't showing up, or people aren't this, or people aren't all of these kinds of things. We have to interrogate the ways in which interpersonal institutional bias has affected those outcomes and see it as an ethical dilemma that we have to address. It's not just something else. Like, this is the job, I believe, of us as educators, that we have to employ this idea. We have to begin to really tackle and understand these things as ethical issues that if we don't address, we are what? We are complicit in those systems. So what this does not look like is when people say things like, well, women aren't interested in tech careers. Well, women aren't interested in tech careers because of many root causes, right? And there certainly are women who are, but when we hear statements like that, it's because of deep institutionalized issues and ideologies that have created those outcomes. Or when people use things like, they just don't succeed in that type of role. That is language that, again, is not understanding the barriers that people face. Or when people say things like, well, they didn't ask for more. That is complicit in things like the pay gap, right? And so we have to begin to, recognize that all of these things are systemic bias. And so when we hear things like this from our colleagues or in our own brains, we have to ask those questions about how is the system playing into these outcomes. So how can we use root cause analysis to reveal inequities our marginalized people are facing? And I've got a ton of resources on root cause analysis on my website. How are we considering, again, these prompts are things that we can ask ourselves, we can ask on our teams. How are we considering institutional barriers that marginalized and minoritized people face in the workplace and actively working to remove those obstacles and supplant them with support, right? How are we looking at the barriers? Who's being served and who's not being served? In what ways are we establishing guardrails that attempt to protect us from biased decisions, policies, and practices? I wrote an article, I think a few weeks ago. I took a road trip. It wasn't a road trip. I was going to teach somewhere, and it was easier to drive. And I was very tired, and I was falling asleep and hitting the little rumble strips, right? And talking about how those rumble strips are ways to sort of alert us of like, hey, wake up, you're about to run off the road, right? So that's what we want to create. How are we creating rumble strips or guardrails that are going to alert us when we are employing things that are then complicit in the kinds of things that we don't want to perpetuate? So some strategies that you can employ here. So get ready. We're going to do another reflection and then a small discussion, a brief discussion group. So we want to expand our knowledge and awareness. And that means that we're constantly expanding how we look at the world. We want to push ourselves and others to think about issues systemically. This is particularly important when it comes to sort of standard diversity, equity, and inclusion work, that it has a tendency to be reduced to interpersonal of like, well, I'm not racist, or I didn't do that to them. We want to really push people to think about the system. How is the system creating these outcomes? How are we using root cause analysis as a tool to understand the issues of inequity? All right, so pause and reflect and get ready to share a goal. But actually, we're going to get you to share your goal in a breakout room. Now, just to clarify, Natasha, you're the person logged in that has the people in a room, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So as y'all are starting to reflect, I'm going to set up a really brief breakout room, and you're going to talk about the first half of the model together. I know that was short, but you're going to have another chance to talk in small groups here in a second. Any questions that came up in your conversations or standout things that you'd like to share?
I have a question about like hearing everybody's voices. What are your suggestions for like let's say you're in a meeting, but you're not the leader of that meeting, but you notice that not everybody's getting a chance to share or not everybody's voice is being heard. Like, how would you recommend gently invite, pushing that direction when you're not actually in charge?
Yeah, so if you feel like you're getting a little bit more air mic space than others, you can always say, Ashley, I noticed that it looks like you've got a great thought that's spinning in your head. I was wondering if you wanted to share that, right? Or if I'm talking and I interrupt Debbie, you could say, oh, Megan, hold on just a second. Let's let Debbie finish her thought before you share your idea. Or if Eric says something and then I say the same thing and everyone's like, great idea, Megan. Then you can be like, well, I think that was a really great way to build on and expound upon Eric's idea, right? So you're really pointing to the different kinds of spaces. If you're in a virtual setting, now this does not happen very often, but I was in a meeting this morning and someone messaged like, Megan, you're really quiet. And I don't normally have this issue, but I really was having a hard time sort of like getting my ideas out there, right? And what she could have done is said, I think Megan's got an idea. Let's make some space for her to like share whatever it is that's on her mind. And if you feel like you don't have any power in that space, then, if you're sitting next to someone, you could message them, right? Or like sort of wave at them and say like, what do you think? Right? So like you're trying to get them to engage. You never want to call on somebody if it's going to like terrify them, right? But, if you really think somebody's got something, one of the things, again, it's how do you notice? How are you listening and how are you questioning? So NLQ, this is something that I don't know where I learned this, but like notice, listening, question of like, I noticed, Mindy, that it looks like you've got something really interesting spinning, or I saw you taking some notes. Would you be willing to share that? So again, just finding ways to kind of bring voices in. Is that helpful, Dana? All right, good. All right. Well, let's take a step forward and look at the next part of the model, and those are the practices. So there's two key parts here. That's the human-centered design and then being an accountable lifelong learner. So the first is human-centered. So this uses an assets perspective to really begin to think about how do we understand the value of people and what they bring to a space. So an inclusive leader is really working from an asset, or an asset mindset comes from the psychological literature of like being strengths-based thinking. And so it uses that kind of mindset to recognize the value and truly celebrate the beauty and value of diversity to a space, rather than saying it's different. I noticed Davey put in the chat earlier, they said, the status quo, right? And this is really kind of to this piece here. And so an inclusive leader intentionally leads with empathy, curiosity, and open-mindedness. And that is to strengthen the dignity of all of the people around us. And the next key piece here is an accountable lifelong learner. And I like to split this into two pieces. So being a lifelong learner and being accountable. And that's something that came up with a lot of your feedback initially. And so here, an inclusive leader is reflecting on their personal and institutional actions, and you're committed to learning more about what you don't know, including other ways of knowing and doing. And so what this doesn't mean that you're going to go ask your one Black friend to explain all of, Black culture, right? We're not going to go ask one person to speak for an entire population of people. It is not a monolith, but it means that you're going to read books. It means that you're going to, I used to say follow different people on Twitter, but I'm not advocating for that anymore, but follow them wherever people are, whatever platform that you like, but to learn different ways of knowing and doing and thinking. And so that becomes sort of visibility into other ways of knowing and doing. It also means that you're personally accountable for your mistakes, your failures, and your mishaps, because you're going to make them, right? You're accountable to those, and you're not deflecting. You're not avoiding responsibility, and you're not claiming good intent. Because when you claim good intent, you're not honoring the gift that someone has given you to help you understand and increase your social consciousness, right? So if someone says, hey, Megan, like, there's this thing that you did, I don't think it was very socially conscious, or a real life example of something that happened is someone emailed all of the graduates of one of the programs I graduated from and said, please tell us about all of the ways that you experienced oppression in our school. And this was someone reply alled to them and said, you want us to relive our trauma, to tell you about all of these things. And there are better ways that you could do this. And the person who is a person in a position of power replied all and said, oh, but I meant well, right? So that is not being accountability to the gift that someone gave. They could have said, wow, you're right. We really didn't think this through. You're right. There are better ways to do this. You're right. I want to try to figure out things, another way and approach to do this. And so, because again, it really, really reflected on their leadership to say, oh, and they actually listed in the email all of the things that they had done for Black people at the university, right? So like that is not the kind of response that dignifies the contribution that someone offered, right? So what this doesn't look like is that's not how we do it. That's not what we meant, or don't be so sensitive. So some examples of prompts that you can use here are collectively thinking, how are we shifting our mindsets to both value and elevate different ways of knowing and doing? And so if you're new to that sort of language, different ways of knowing and doing, the sort of easiest or sort of simplest approach to that is looking up and studying individualistic versus collectivist cultures. That's a great way to kind of start to understand different ways of knowing and doing, so that you're not always privileging one way of knowing and doing, asking questions like, how are we celebrating differences rather than suggesting people hide and avoid them? This is something that's been really relevant to the polarity of the United States recently, is this sort of belief of that somehow the Black Lives Matter movement has caused the polarity in our nation because it's asking us to talk about difference, right? Like that is a misconception of what that has actually done, right? It's a belief that like, please don't make me talk about this because it makes me uncomfortable. Well, who is that prioritizing? It's prioritizing the comfort of the dominant group, right? And so we don't want to be those people. We don't want to be the people who are saying, please don't make me uncomfortable by talking about something that I have not learned how to talk about. And then finally, how are we practicing visible accountability for mistakes, failures, and mishaps? So this leader could have said, you know what, thank you for this gift of this knowledge. It's important to me that we get this right. So there was an opportunity for this person to really lead and model accountability. So some strategies that you can employ here are to really think about and encourage your students to be curious and respectful of other ways of knowing and doing. You want to emphasize empathy and accountability as a crucial skill for your team culture. And so we'll talk about those outcomes later in just a moment here, but that which we measure is that which we value. And so if we think these things are important, how are we measuring them? A friend of mine that I grew up with her, and so I'm trying to reconnect with people since I'm back in my hometown, and she works for a big chemical plant. And she said that part of their annual reviews and their bonuses are dependent on one of the qualities, the factors, is how inclusive they are as a colleague and as a leader. And I was like, tell me more. This is amazing, right? Like, so it's some kind of evaluation that they all have to do one another to determine, like, are they a good team member that make other people feel valued and included? And it's some kind of rating. That is trying to institutionalize a practice that values these things. All right, so I'm going to give you just a moment to reflect on this one. So think about the strategies, those prompts. Which of these are you interested in employing? So I'll give you just a minute to reflect. Share a goal that you want to set for yourself related to practices. We're going to wrap up with outcomes, do another 5-minute breakout, and then we'll be able to end for the day. All right, so the first contribution here says model accountability for your team and discuss weaknesses and what can be improved. Yeah, thank you. One of the key things when we model accountability is it reduces power structures, right? When you say, look, I made a mistake, I messed up. It's saying, I'm not trying to sit up at this top, pinnacle here. I'm saying we're all equals and we're all, contributing in the same way. And that's, again, a value of being an inclusive leader, is reducing those power structures. Someone adds, definitely want to find more ways to celebrate differences without tokenizing them. Great. Practice saying I made a mistake or I was wrong instead of common colloquialisms like, oh, I lied, or wait, no, I meant. Make sure you're listening for and inviting feedback from colleagues. Lean into the differences between colleagues and listen to understand their perspectives and experiences. I have a friend who always says, listen as if you might learn something. And so that's a really helpful kind of catchphrase there. I want to be more curious, mindful, and slower, thoughtful. I like the idea of celebrating difference. Yeah, to me, this is an asset-based mindset that's very an easy, I don't know about easy, but it's a simple shift of like, instead of difference is bad, difference is good, right? It's looking to see that something adds value rather than somehow it's taking away from it. Acknowledge when you make a mistake, learn from it, and show that you're working to improve. Actually take action when you hear or receive feedback. Yeah. Now, certainly you could receive feedback that is, not from a good place, right? So I always like to say, wow, thank you for that feedback. I really want to think about it. It's a way of acknowledging and saying that you do and do think about it, right? But doesn't mean you always have to act on feedback. All right. Recognizing areas where you're making mistakes and prioritizing self-reflection and education. Continue to challenge the groups I'm leading to think about different ways of knowing and doing. Let's be curious. Awesome. All right. So the last part of the model are these outcomes. And there's two. That's culturally intelligent communication and inclusive collaboration. And so this model, again, it's iterative. You're doing all the things all at once. You're not going to start with just, well, who am I? And not think about all the ways that you're plugging into the world. But these outcomes, these are things that we're striving for that are really a positive function and output of all of the other different elements. And so when we think about culturally intelligent communication, to first define culture, the culture as we know it, it's this implication and this sort of integrated pattern of human behavior. It includes our communications, our actions, our customs, our beliefs, our values. And so that culture, is the culturally intelligent communication means we're thoughtful to multiple ways of knowing and doing and bringing in all of those different kinds of things to how we are communicating. And so an inclusive leader is paying attention to whose voices, values, and ways of knowing and doing are present, missing, or silenced. And they're actively and empathically listening and searching for cues to bridge the gaps among diverse people. And so a lot of you have talked about listening. Listening is really key to this. How are we paying attention? And some of the planning prompts help us kind of really anchor that. The next here is inclusive collaboration. So an inclusive leader is actively and equitably engaging diverse perspectives, experiences, and backgrounds to enrich the collectively shared environment, and you're balancing the assumed norms to allow for more authentic engagement. And what that last phrase means, to balance the assumed norms. So if your team that you're working on, say, for example, so my team at Texas Instruments, everything was anchored around football and going to the bar to drink. And as a young 20-something, that was fine for me, right? But there were other people who didn't want to participate. They didn't want to go to the bar all the time. And if all of the socializing happens around football and beer, that is a norm. But who is that excluding, right? So it doesn't mean that we all have to stop watching football and drinking beer, but how are we doing other activities that bring in other ways of knowing and doing? If you have a team that's all young parents and all you do is talk about, toddlers? Is that being inclusive of someone who maybe can't have kids and wants to have kids? Like, how are we looking at the balance norms and balancing those? So that's inviting other people to bring in their hobbies and their things to a space. I remember my very first lunch with all of my colleagues at Texas Instruments. All they talked about was TV and football, and I remember asking them, like, is this all y'all talk about? And they're like, well, what do you do? And I was like, well, I just went to West Africa and I'm doing a documentary. And they're like, oh my gosh, you don't belong. And that was a snap moment for me of like, all right, if I want to fit in, I have to be this other thing, right? And so an inclusive leader would say, oh, well, let's learn more about what Megan's working on and bring that into the space. So what this doesn't look like is what we already talked about before. Someone repeats or rephrases what was said by someone else and gets credit for it. Or when we say things like, well, they didn't say anything, so they're fine with it. So they're ready to go along with it. Or they always go along with it like we usually do, so it's not a big deal to operate as we always have. Now, the prompts that I want to encourage you to employ here are thinking about in what ways are we actively listening to marginalized voices and striving to incorporate their ideas, and how are we evaluating and refreshing our team norms so that people more authentically engage. And the strategies that I want you to employ is to, and again, this goes back to what I said earlier, we measure that which we value. And so ensure that culturally intelligent communication and inclusive collaboration are metrics for both individual and group evaluations. This is something I regularly prompt myself with. So I like these prompts because they help me. So I'm always asking myself these questions. Whose voices are missing or silenced? Why? What will I do? Who's being served? Who's not being served? So these kinds of questions help me constantly think about what I'm doing and what I'm creating and whether I'm being inclusive or not. Think about ways that you can measure the shifts away from dominant cultures. Again, it's not saying we can't do that. It's not a zero-sum game. It's saying, how do we fold in and bring in more ways? The last thing is to host listening sessions, ask great questions, but the key here is don't forget to listen, and then make sure that you are taking collective and grounded action on what you learn. Davey asks, how are questions languaged in which it excludes certain groups? Okay, to provide feedback. Yeah, thank you for that contribution. That's a great question as well. All right, so what we're going to do for the last few minutes here is we're going to go into another reflective discussion. I'm going to put you back into the same groups. I know we're bumping up into the end of the time, but I want to make sure that you have some space to talk about this in your groups. So let me get the groups back open, and I have availability to stay past the 30 minutes. So, but we'll come back at the end to wrap up. All right, welcome back. So I want to, for the sake of the hour, I want to make sure I wrap up. For those who can stay, I'm going to stick around. But I want to invite you to provide some feedback to me. I value feedback sincerely. That helps me improve my services. I'm going to put that link in the chat. But as I do that, I also want to let you know that, if you join my mailing list, I commit to sending valuable resources to you all. And I do have, if you want to dive deeper into all of this, the Intentionally Engineer Inclusion Program, this is the inaugural cohort. It starts in January. So it's a 12-week program. It's semi-asynchronous. We're going to have monthly workshops, coaching and training, and it's going to be community driven. And so you can check that out on my website as well. But I do want to make sure that you provide feedback. So Natasha's asked, is anyone online planning to attend the social tonight? And so again, if you need to drop off, I respect that drop off, but I want to give some more space for debrief from the conversation, from your discussion. Any questions that came up or takeaways that you want to share with the group?
I think a takeaway that Ashley and I both had leaving our breakout session was definitely just trying to listen to understand different perspectives. when it comes to that human-centered approach. And it's not just, those who maybe like typically more may have the culturally intelligent communication to verbalize like equity and inclusion, how we can see that in practice. But for those who may not be there yet, may not be at that level of competency, that we can help to push and also guide too. But that really does involve having to challenge ourselves to, I guess, remind ourselves where we were at that point and listening to understand like, hey, I notice some discomfort within maybe like body language, or I've noticed that you've kind of maybe haven't been sharing out as much as the rest of the group, inviting them into the conversation to share that rather than shaming them for not saying anything or shaming them for saying something that might go against the grain as well. That listening to understand, it works both ends essentially. And that's something that comes up in, the difference between discussion, debate, and dialogue. You're not sitting there to debate how do we create more equity within the college. That needs to be more so facilitated as a dialogue to understand all different types of experiences. So that way there aren't any blind spots as well. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Davey. By the way, I read this past week using the term blind spot is ableist language. So I have to work on this because I use the term all the time, right? And so I really have to think about other language I can use instead of that. What else?
So I was in a group with Terry, and not to put specifically Terry on the spot, but I think that just some of the questions that were posed, they're good questions that we should just generally explore as a full committee. We're not talking about just leaders in our own respective units, but we all have shared ownership in this committee as well. And so how can we all kind of contribute and bring some of these concepts and make sure that we're really modeling some of these ideas and values and evoking them in how we are running the ICC as well. Right. Yeah. Hopefully that's not putting too many words in your mouth, Terry.
No, that's excellent. I was just going to add, I think as we are growing as a council, it's going to be important that we're able to be comfortable with expressing ourselves. And I think we tried to have a little bit of that modeling with the CU dialogue person coming in last year. But it's going to take some time for us to, get this moving in the direction in which we want to see it in terms of how we are interacting with each other, how folks are able and feel comfortable with making contributions to the conversations. And so I definitely feel uncomfortable calling on people that may not have anything to contribute. I don't want to put folks on the spot. And so I do rely on folks to speak up or write something in the chat. Or, if I miss you, if someone has their hand raised, and sometimes I can just kind of blank out because I'm listening and taking notes and doing so many different things that, hey, Terry, I'm right here. Can you please call on me? So I think, as we're growing as a council, that I'm going to make mistakes. I probably made a lot of these mistakes already. So just understanding that we have to work together and try to make sure that everyone voices are heard. And I know we are on a tight schedule, 1.5 hours every meeting is just not enough. And so understanding that we can find ways in which we can engage with each other outside of meetings and make sure we're building the relationships that we need to be successful.
You can also employ some facilitation strategies. So using like round robin brainstorming, constructivist listening. So these are some facilitation protocols that help sort of embed equity so that everyone's getting that voice. And I'll drop some links in the chat to those resources from my website as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. What else? Again, I know we're over time, but I'm happy to to keep hearing your ideas that you'd like to share. All right. Well, I want to thank you all so much for coming today. Thank you for contributing to our learning together. I have your emails for registering for today, so I'll send a follow-up so you'll have that in your inbox with some of the other resources that I shared today that may not have been on the page. And I sincerely welcome and value your feedback, and let me know how I can serve you. My goal as a business owner and a practitioner is to make meaningful resources that take some of this to the practical. Like, how do we apply this? Like, what's a tool I can use to put into practice some of the things that we're learning? And so I have tons of free things on my website. And if you have ideas, I welcome your ideas of the next tool that I should create. And so, again, I'm so grateful for your time, for your efforts, and for all of your commitment to improving access, equity, inclusion, and diversity and belonging within your institution at CU Boulder. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Megan, for being with us today. And thank you to the council members. Hopefully you had an opportunity to read and look at Natasha's email about next semester, making sure we have our scheduled meetings. So we'll be looking at the surveys for that. And any questions around where we are with the action plans for the CEAS DEI goals, please feel free to email me or email Keith as well around that. But those things are in motion, and hopefully we'll have some information coming out, if not next week when we return from holiday break. So thank you all. Have a wonderful holiday and winter break. Thank you again, Megan. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
From the in-person
Bye, everyone.
folks as well.